Yes, well, welcome to my channel. This is our Michael Fisher speaking today with Richard Bickel, who's going to, I asked him to basically, I knew he'd been reading my book. This is the Marianne Williamson Presidential Phenomenon that I completed in early 2021. And I asked him, well, if you read it, do you have any questions or thoughts or comments? We should have a discussion. And I'm looking forward to that today. I have done probably about 6 or 7 videos that on my YouTube channel for those watching my channel that include Marianne Williamson, includes 1 or 2 about the book, but pretty generally those are not in depth, but you can certainly check those out on my YouTube channel. Thank you very much for listening today. Richard Bickel, I'm going to turn it over to you. Glad to have you here today.
Oh, thanks, Michael. For full disclosure, so yeah, I'm Richard and I live in Victoria, BC, and I'm really happy that my sister and brother-in-law have recently, Michael, have relocated here to the island. And so I was up to visit this summer and I saw I think what I asked about, that I was curious about the book, and so Michael said, "Here, take a copy home with you," and so I started reading it, and I picked up my second case of COVID.
Yikes.
And so I actually completed reading the book. I was in quarantine, that's all I had to read. And so I finished it while in quarantine. And so I mentioned to Barbara that I had some feedback, or it stirred some interest for me reading the book. And so here we are now to discuss it. Yeah.
So we're both Canadians, just to be upfront and honest here, and Canadians, but I think you have an American background in history, Richard.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, my dad was from the U.S. and he came up, I guess he was late 20s. He came up to Saskatchewan he was a Lutheran minister, and he became a citizen and spent the rest of his life here. And my mom, we met my mom in Regina, who's Canadian. But we would go back to the States, and large extended family, and very American and religious and so on. And so I'm very affected by what happens in the States because it's in my blood, for better or worse. I'm a Canadian, but yeah, I have that connection.
Yeah, and of course, your sister, who I married, 32 years ago, she, of course, became an American citizen while we were living in the United States. And I think that's important for viewers to know that I did, with Barbara, live in the United States for, 9 years. And this was 2008 to 2017. So we got out of America just as Trump was coming in, and we came into America just as Obama got elected. So pretty dynamic time in American politics. So yes, we're Canadian. My wife is also now American. She's chosen to become an American citizen, and so she became quite politicized in this course of working and living in the United States. So affected me as well. So no doubt one of the reasons I would have written a book about 2 American, politician leaders. So I'll just turn it over to you now with any comments or questions on reading the book. I really look forward to this. Thank you, Richard.
Well, yeah, I guess to follow up on your last comment there. So you were, I guess my question is, you were prompted by your experiences there? Like, do you think you would have written this book if you hadn't been in the States?
That's a good question. which brings up, sort of an issue of why does this book come out? I think it's my sixth book kind of or so that's come out, and why on Marianne Williamson. And I think I really do have to acknowledge that there's a sort of a series of my interest as a thinker, philosopher, educator, etc., artist, interested in what's happening in the world, as I know you are, Richard, too, in a serious way, that I got into writing sort of intellectual autobiographies at some point. In the one before Marianne Williamson is this one on Four Arrows, an Indigenous educator from the United States as well, lives also in Mexico. So that was my first intellectual biography. And because I got to know him and was interested in his work, and I'll get to the finer detail of why him and then why to a book where I'm, focused on Marianne Williamson. So you can see this is really a second in my series of writing intellectual biographies, which I find very interesting. But I was interesting. I was looking in my journals the other day, and I had this interest to write about other authors, right? Other than my own writing, which I love writing about myself and my ideas. But I was really interested to study and write about other people going way back to 1983. I actually have book proposals I was searching through the other day of wanting to write about people who I think have great influence in the world or could have great influence in the world, and do an interpretation of their life and work in some way. And I'm not a typical biographer. I'm not trained to do biographies. That's an art itself. But I was very interested in how they use intellectual ideas and how those ideas manifest in people's life and work. And so I follow the trajectory of their ideas and their philosophies. And that's kind of how I write. And then I throw a lot of myself in there. So both the book on Marianne Williamson, as you read, has a lot of me in there. I'm a lot of my own thinking, as well as tracking, her and the phenomenon of her running for American politics for president of the United States, as a matter of fact, this last campaign. Four Arrows, again, interested in his work, but I'm putting a lot of my stuff in. And just for the quick opener hint was, I'm interested in fear. And both of these authors, Marianne Williamson and Four Arrows, write some very interesting things about fear. And so as a researcher, thinker on fear since 1989, I'm attracted to write about people I really care about, these ideas about fear. So Richard, would I have written this book? I think going into the United States, number one, I felt so much fear in the culture. I felt it in myself. I felt it in Barbara. I felt it in just the ambiance of being in that nation. And especially in, these last, years, decades, I probably would have if I was living in the 60s there too. It's an intense nation in terms of the vibration and the way information travels, the way people pay attention to politics in a different way than they do in Canada. I think they're much more active generally. And so I would say I would have written probably this book just because of her, Richard. I'll say that. Because in 1991, when I was in Search of Fearlessness, that project I started, and I know you were a little bit involved in that in Calgary, I was already looking at her work. So it started in 1991, as far as I can tell, that somebody said to me one day, now, Michael, you really ought to read Marianne Williamson. She writes a lot about fear. That's where it kind of began as a seed. And she's writing interesting things about the healing of America by 1997, a book she wrote, The Healing of America. I mean, what an amazing title, number one. And then here she was a woman. And so I kind of followed her in pieces, but not systematically until I came back to the United States and heard she was running for the candidate for the Democratic National Party leader.
Yeah, and did that get the germ going then for the book?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, because we had got back to Canada. We were in the next couple of years watching what was going on in the States with Trump as leader, and oh my gosh, what a turmoil and what a very interesting phenomenon in terms of history and politics, certainly in North
Yeah.
America. And then by the time I saw her throw her hat in to the race, which I think was in late 2019 or so, I said, oh, okay, so this woman is, and she was a Bernie Sanders supporter before that, which I had found little bits about. I didn't know about that before. So it's not like politics are new to her. But when I saw her put her hat in, ooh, I said, this is going to be very interesting. Will people in America, will the consciousness in America understand Marianne Williamson? I think that's kind of a undercurrent of my interest. And then will they understand her teaching about fear?
Mhm.
So kind of maybe those two really spun for me to just say, okay, I'm going to dive in, read everything I can on what she's written, what other people have written about her. So that's kind of how I started as a researcher.
Yes, yes, and yeah, I thought the book in the book you did a good job of documenting her, that like the phenomena of her running for
Yeah.
the for the president, and then your critique of it, but what you're telling me now gives me some background of where you were coming from in doing that, right? Because I mean, I hadn't heard of her, to be honest, and even though I know she's a celebrity in the States, and so yeah, but now when I think, you did an excellent job of documenting that, because for sort of a person in the spiritual camp to be running for president, like as you said, you wanted to document it, right? And I guess my big takeaway from it, I mean, when I read it, I was like, yeah, I'd like to know more about her, but so far it's only been to the extent that I Googled her and read a bit, but it didn't take me further than that. So, I think the whole question, I thought the big theme of the book, the big takeaway for me was the question of leadership.
Oh.
And which I think ties into the whole thing of fear, like the culture that we're in, and how fear, the role it's playing. And as you were just saying, in the States, you really, it's big there, and a big factor. And then the question of leadership, because to be honest, I thought it was going to be a book about Trump, right? Because he's on the cover, but it's because of the fascination, with the American flag. But it's because of the fascination with the perverse fascination with Trump, right? That's why I was like, I got to read this, right?
Oh, cool.
So,
That's interesting.
yeah, and the fact that I thought you were dispassionate in your analysis of Trump, which then I was like, and that bothered me, because I'm like, I just want this guy to go away. But I mean, and I mean, that's the fear thing, right? And you didn't give him a lot of space. So I was like, okay, it's about Marianne Williamson.
Yeah.
And then about her attempt to bring her values into that arena, right?
Into that arena.
Yeah, and how ultimately she failed in that attempt, and then what impact has it had, and then that kind of leads me to that question of what is leadership, and what is going to be effective, because that's the question you had, like your disappointment, I think, is she failed, and what is and for me, I was like, well, what do we do in this critical time, and what can we do, right? And that's for me, that's leadership, right? Like, as individuals and as a culture, right? So,
So maybe let's just tweeze leadership out a little bit so you and I get on the same page a little bit if we can, even if we have some differences about it. Let's do that, because I appreciate pulling leadership out in a discussion of this book. Even though it's pretty obvious in the book, I'm talking about leadership a lot. I think it's pretty obvious in the book that, and it's obvious that these two are leaders in their own worlds, both definitely with spectacle attention from media, from followers. So I'm confronting these two leaders. So that image represents that confrontation. And then that idea of leadership is so under pressure today, of a lot of the population not trusting leaders, number one, certainly in the political sphere. So how are they going to trust Marianne Williamson any different than they would trust a Donald Trump or, another leader that's running? All of those things became interesting to me. And I go back to my own leadership because I have also practiced out in front public leadership in a small way in my own organization or a community that I was involved in, as you know, the In Search of Fearlessness community in Calgary. And that was leading with a particular vision, a very clear sort of mission, vision. And, there's lots of leaders that have done this throughout history. And we also know there's some great leaders and there's some leaders that are very despotic and questionable and so on. I think that the book is a chance for people to maybe rethink and perhaps give a little bit more compassion toward leadership. So I start that philosophically. It goes way back in my history when I first studied in the 1980s liberation theories, Richard. So theories of liberation theology coming out of South America, liberation education also coming out of Paulo Freire's work in Brazil. As an educator, I was interested how education and how leadership in education, policy in education, can move us toward a liberational society. And eventually I put a label on that as a path of fearlessness. So I was leading a community of people. And I've also been around other leaders who have been very influential in my life in helping me become more conscious, good citizen, whatever you want to call it. And one of the things that I see over and over is the quick judgments. So here's really my take on leadership, and I'd like to hear yours. Your dad was a leader, for example, right? And comes from a tradition of leaders within the church, the Lutheran church ministry and Christianity itself. And that's a thousands and thousands of years tradition of leadership, including the icon of Jesus as the leader, and so on and so on. So I'm very interested in the tension and that tension around how humans relate to leader and the idea of leadership. And the tendency I was just saying about that I've noticed over many years, including in my own experiences, there's also this easy tendency to pull leaders down when we get a chance. And there's sort of this theory or phenomenon some people have spoken about. I'm not sure exactly where it all comes from, so some research too, no doubt, is when someone rises up, be ready to be taken down. It's like an automatic principle of a lower common denominator. And we see this in organizational development research as well. And yet, a lot of us want to have leaders. That's just a fact. Whether we like that or think it's good. There's some interesting theorizing coming out of Four Arrows' work as an Indigenous perspective that you can have many kinds of leaders, and that's great in these Indigenous cultures. And those leaders, move with certain things that certain people do in leadership. And then another, if the topic is something else and it's about war, maybe then, other leaders are consulted. So there's many multiple leaders. But, there is a chief as well. And the chief is a spokesperson, just like us and the white people, we have spokespersons for higher principles, for God or the goddess or whatever the principle or higher ideas of ethics. So I'm interested in ethical leadership. So let's be clear about that. I'm not really interested in leaders for the sake of leaders. I'm interested in ethical leadership on the way to liberation. And what are the kinds of leaders and what can we learn from them? So lots of studies have been done, right? On Gandhi, for example, or Nelson Mandela, some of the great leaders, and many others. And so that is really, this book was really in a leadership, political science section of Routledge Publishing or Peter Lang Publishing of that book. It comes out of political science. It's not education. It's about leadership. So that's why they accepted the book. So I am a believer that leaders need to be supported. And that's kind of a general principle. And then, of course, the question, well, what if they're not a good leader? Well, what? Okay, so what do you want to do? Shoot them? You want to take them down? You want to, strip them? What do you want to do to them? And so I'm always listening to when is fear, a fear-based way of thinking, the projection onto the other who has power, and how we as human beings have a tendency to want to pull them down. But back to the indigenous perspective, just really briefly, is 4 arrows, as he says, is you have to understand we're a social species. Most people have been saying this forever. Certainly the communal cultures in the indigenous traditions, they know we're social. They know we're a communal creature. It's just this Western individualized, kind of Western Enlightenment philosophy that's taught us to be so individualistic, and that's our freedom or autonomy, and so on and so on. But our history as a species, both biologically and culturally and historical, is arguably a social species. One of the things we see in social species is that there are leaders. There are natural individuals within social species of all kinds that take leadership on especially when a group is under stress. And there, in a social species, you cue into when there's a threat. Let's just say is herd of deer, puma, mountain lion comes by, somebody detects it. Most of the animals do not just react arbitrarily. They wait to see the leaders. And so you get an alpha male, you get alpha females, right? And you get this in horses, and anybody who's worked with horses knows the same thing. They want to individually react, but they don't. They're smart enough to know you don't just go everybody bouncing off and reacting. They wait and they look and they sniff the alpha, the leaders. And so I am a real strong believer that we do need leadership. We need alpha males, females to survive well. Now, of course, the problem is how they get distorted and twisted. So those 2 people are definitely alpha male and alpha females, however we like them or not like them. So that's just my quick take on leadership, Richard.
Well, thanks, Michael. Yeah, for me, the question is, and I think you might agree that we're in a crisis of leadership.
Yeah.
Because of the critical nature, and so it's like where's the Moses that's going to lead us to the out of the desert into the promised land, and so it's it's more relevant now, it seems anyway, and so I guess for we're coming from a different place, I think, in that yes, I came out of a tradition of leadership and so on, in my family background, but I crashed and burned trying to be in that situation, and I was and as a result of that, I have been forced to because I can't look at leadership like you do, in that, like, I totally agree, leadership it's sort of a neutral, it's just is, right?
Yeah.
And it's part of the social fabric, but but you look at and I mean, because of my culture is patriarchal, and it's corrupt, right? It's corrupt. And so that my experience of leadership, I unfortunately, because it was intimate for me, being, like a child of a figurehead, and then I also saw the corruption firsthand, right? And so it kind of wrecked that for me.
Yeah.
In that I did my best, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
it was a wonderful thing, right? I mean, it's a big part of who I am. But then I crashed and burned, and due to my own, I mean, I had to look at my addictions and so on, and it all came to a head. I'm in my early 30s, right? And so ever since then, so I was dethroned from my leadership position through I undid it myself, or whatever forces were at work, right? But it's ultimately my responsibility. And then for me, so that my take, like, I was listening to your conversation with Barbara this morning, and about that, that for me, I've had to go, it's what I do as an individual that matters, as like leader, a lot of humility and leadership, right? A new humility, right? That it's not a given, that it has to be earned, and that it's if I'm given and it has a huge responsibility, and that it's so we see the great leaders often paid with their lives, right? Mm-hmm. So taking the ultimate risk and the ultimate responsibility and paying with their own lives, like, that's the greatest leaders. That seems to be the case with many, right? And so it's like so to the extent that I'm willing to risk as a leader, and it's up, and but that is service. Because say, for instance, I'm involved in town in my small municipality here, and so I kind of see how the politics works, and it's like there's such a leadership vacuum. It's just waiting to be filled, but it takes it's a ton of hard work, right? To lead the way, to be the light that other people will, gravitate towards that light. And so for me, I feel I could be doing more in the leadership role, but I do okay. But I mean, anyway, so that's why it brings it up for me. For me, it's my individual responsibility. I think if we all took our leadership roles if we all understood it and took it seriously, that would solve all our problems.
Yeah, that's an argument.
Each individual would be willing to do that, and to the extent, and to anything that we do leads to the solution. And I mean, that's what I believe. I had a good friend just passed from cancer, and it was a time for reflection, and in the memorial we had for her. And the things, like, she lived with cancer for 16 years, knew, after 14 years, knew it was going to take her in the end. And she was 55, I guess, when she died. But the things she did, I only knew her when she had cancer, but the action she took, she was such a leader. And that's what people spoke about her. She was such a leader in initiating positive things in her community, and she was willing. She took, she led the way, and I guess because of her situation, right, that she knew her life was fragile, and she took risks, or she just was in a place. So it's, for me, it's those individual actions that we all can take. That but it's incumbent on everybody And that's, I mean, it's incumbent on me. But I guess if we can encourage each other in that way, that's the best thing we can do, is encourage each other in our own worlds to be doing that.
Oh yeah, that's the micro level, right? That's what I call kind of a micro level or a meso level. And then we get to the kind of macro level of analysis. You're dealing now with structures that are already in place and have been in place historically for, you know, hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so we have to also manage that. Like, and that's when Marianne Williamson, she would totally support this kind of direction, as she talks about, and I write in the book, is she talks about citizen leadership or citizenship education, that it ought to be about citizens learning how to lead and lead, not, you know, obviously your own life, but lead your communities, your locally, and then go as far as you want. She totally encourages people to go into politics. Now, you know, the more radical people say, let's let the system die, let's let it collapse, let's, you know, and then we can start new, we can have this much more, you know, purist kind of level from the individual responsibility. And anarchists have been saying that forever, you know, let's just, you lead yourself well, don't interfere with others, and we'll all be great. We don't need all this infrastructure. So Marianne Williamson comes in, and this is what I'm interested in. She says, well, that's all fine, but we have a system that's still here and it's not going away tomorrow. And so she says, I want to be president of that system. You know what I'm saying? I thought that was a really powerful choice, because she knows, you know, the system needs to collapse. She talks about it in every speech she ever gave and has been doing since the early 90s. So it's not like she's not a critic, and she's a severe critic, but she's not taking that kind of position, you know, more that you or I are also talking when we talk at this kind of micro level. She takes it, but then she says, and we need leaders for the macro scale as well.
Yeah. I mean, if a person ends up, she's a celebrity or was in that position to be in that sphere,
yeah,
for sure.
And I guess it comes from followers too. I mean, that's my own experience. Is like I can try to be a leader, I can work hard at it, but if you don't have the following, yeah, at some level, it's not going to go very far, and it'll eventually fizzle out, or it'll collapse under your own frustration of you don't have followers. So I mean, I can easily get into that. You know, I only have, you know, 20 people watching my videos, and you know, somebody's got 20,000. So Marianne did have, that was her legacy. She's one of those personalities, and the certain conditions coming out of the 60s and her parents and the kind of situation, or it's a bit of biography in the book, that she was a natural born leader, as we talk about, in a certain kind of way. That was because so many conditions of her parenting, the kind of way the world was, and who knows, right, what kind of soul or comes into the planet, or whatever kind of language we try to bring about a person's constitution and their ability. And there's just some children, we see it, they are alpha children. I teach it, I was a daycare the other day, and I watched this little 4-year-old girl. She's a total alpha female. She's got like 4 or 5, you know, other little girls following her and doing what she wants to do. And she was very kind and she was very gentle, but they were following her. And so, but somebody's not following the others. And I thought it's like there's a natural flow for some individuals. And I think I call it personality. And they have it, as well as some conditions that were good. So she has a huge following. She very did when she started teaching a course in miracles, but she had it before that right to high school. She was already directing and writing plays and actually directing them in grade 11 and 12.
Well, I guess my take on that is that true leadership may not necessarily come through those natural born leaders. It could be the smallest thing done by the humblest of person, who that quality of leadership could be more effective and more like.
Again, I think we're talking differences in scale at the micro
well
scale.
yeah but
scale.
but I think that's why people are not interested in the system as it is, because it's all celebrity, it's all, and then we see, and then it becomes where we're like, this is getting crazy. I mean, I think, but anyway, like we saw with COVID, how the leaders looked really human, right? Because nobody could manipulate the virus, right? So they looked really human, and when they made mistakes, it was right there, right? And so we just saw they're just people like us, right? Just because they're in that position, they fail too, and and so because I guess because like I'm a musician, as you know, right?
Yeah.
And I'll often end up in that role, or I'll play that role of leading the way, right? And but so I'll gather the people around. Here's a project, and oh sure, let's do it, right? And then, but my leadership style, what I found, that type of leadership doesn't work, hasn't worked for in getting the goal that I want, which is to work collaboratively with other musicians. That it requires, like I'm still figuring it out. Like I can't be, like I'll end up, I guess I do a bit of dictating, or I know better, or I don't have to consult you, those negative kind of, but that's my tendency when I'm in that position, right?
Yeah.
Which is like, that's my patriarchal background, right? So,
Yeah.
but it doesn't work, because people get pissed off and they leave, right? And so but then that's like, oh, I want to work with other people. Like my goal, I just want to work with other people. So I learn a new way, which is
For sure.
to allow space for other people, right? So that's not necessarily an alpha thing, right? To allow space for other people.
No, I agree.
And then kind of tap in to the bigger goal, which is making, whether it's in music, like making beautiful music, or whether it's to create a beautiful society, right? But that's what I'm seeing, to allow space for that.
Yeah, I
which
think
is then that's the humility of, it's not about me, it's about the greater good, right? Or the common good, and I think that's why people are pissed off at leadership, because they see people, well, they're in it for themselves, or they don't give a shit about us, and so I can relate to that. I don't see myself in that camp, but I understand that, right? Because yeah.
I think there's all kinds of ways to have positive influence, and that's what I think you're talking about. It can be very micro, it can be very invisible. And even I've heard Marianne Williamson in her speeches say, there's many people out here who are leading, but they're not running for political parties. They're not even interested in that. And they're not running with big followings behind them. They're just doing random acts of kindness, or just small acts of conscious kindness, and they have a great influence. And she says we need all those kinds of leaders, and a lot of those are mothers, who are, for example, who are just doing amazing work, or fathers. And she says I think she has a great respect for that kind of micro level of influence that is a type of guidance or leadership of another kind. But the reality is I took on a project, of writing a book and spending 2 years studying someone who is an overt leader in a structural way in the society. So I'm wondering, my curiosity is did you find that, you were critical of her as a leader, critical of, obviously, of Trump, but were you critical of her as you read the book?
Well, I'm like I said, I didn't want to follow up with her in terms of learning more about her. Like what I learned, it gave me a different perspective than just what you had written. That's all I knew about her, was what I read in your book. So it kind of gave me a bit more information. But like, I think, so sorry, what was your question?
Were you critical of her as a leader? Because it sounds like she's she represents a type of leader I'm hearing that is not necessarily your kind of admiring type of people you admire.
I guess where I'm coming from is that that in I here's what out of our discussion, I'm thinking that I believe we will need to prepare for a different way of things running, and that this way that we're used to, like you say, thousands of years, it could come to an end, and that we may need to we may need to find a new way of doing it, and we're going to have to discover it, right? Because we're so enculturated with this one, right? It's all we know, right? But so that's my thought. I mean, it's part of our world. This, the existing structure is there, and so I didn't. When I read the book, I was interested in the topic, right? But it brought up that question of what is, because in the end, both of them are gone now, right? In terms of, they're not president, and really, what does that matter, right? Or does it? I guess, that's the question, does it? And I mean, obviously it does, but I think the bigger question is I see that we're heading somewhere different, and because of the circumstances we're in. And I mean, if we're looking at big collapse, right? Environmental collapse, and then that will result in societal collapse. What will that look, for instance, right? And then what's that? But we will want to survive, right? So how are we going to survive, and what leadership model? So I feel for my evolution as a person, it's, I don't know. I mean, I have a small business. I'm a boss, right? But it's real humble. We do janitorial, and I work with just people, right? And it's just to pay my bills, right? I mean, so I don't know. It's a complicated question.
Yeah, I think I'd say the book does not go into that kind of thing a lot. So it doesn't do a lot of speculating about future leaders per se.
No.
And again, the type of world, I mean, obviously I'd talk about, because she does, that she knows the world is crumbling too. And America has to revision itself, is how she speaks, right? A revisionist leader. So she's definitely of the camp of a revisionist leader. I would also say Donald Trump is a revisionist leader. And I know some people would go, what? Are you kidding me? And I'd say, no, really, look at him. He is actually quite radical. And many people have written about him. You don't have to be a Trump supporter to write and take a nuanced look. That he is a revisionist, and that's one of the reasons he was so popular, is because he didn't go with the mainstream of even the Conservative Party, and so he got a lot of votes. He won president, so that's no slouch. That is no unimportant phenomenon.
But isn't it because there's a vacuum? I mean, how would Trump get there? There's such a vacuum that where telling lies becomes a virtue, right? Becomes celebrated by that group, right? And which are some of my relatives, right?
Yeah,
so,
I know they are. Yeah.
So but that's because of the vacuum, right? That's
Well,
that's what we're staring at. A vacuum of, because we know the system's collapsing. It's collapsing. So what do we do? Right?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, Richard. You would use the term vacuum, right? And I could definitely say that too. I could say there's a moral vacuum, or a lack of a ethical reference, or losing, what those centers is, right? Those kind of centers. But many people that would support him, they would totally not understand a clue what you're saying. They don't see a vacuum at all. They see that they have the moral center, and they just don't like your moral center. And it's not a vacuum. So what do you say to people like that, right? I mean, they have their center, and it's not the same as your center, but they have a moral center.
Yeah, well, I mean, I see it as a vacuum, they may not, but as far as I'm concerned, the reality is they wouldn't disagree that there's a leadership because they hate Washington, they hate because of the lies, and so that's what I mean by vacuum. There's the leadership is corrupt, right? You can't trust it. They don't share your values or whatever.
Yeah.
We're all in the same boat, right?
I think
But
if there's a vacuum,
how people are coping with it, right?
yeah, I think there's a gap, people in the left feel it as well. As far left as you want to get. And Marianne herself is, they feel if there's a vacuum or a gap, it's like, we don't feel the leaders are listening to the people. I mean, that's why Trump got in, why he's there. They felt enough people, he was listening to them. And it's the same with the left. They don't feel like neither party is listening to them. So I think that's probably the vacuum or gap you're speaking about. So one of the things I tried to do in the book, because I knew I'm still caught in the book, right, as an analyst, in many ways, I'm still caught on the left-right dynamic. I mean, just even putting Marianne on the cover, Trump over here, right? It's like, it's already setting up dichotomies. And I know that's an unfortunate position. However, one of the things I did do is I designed the cover to also show them much closer to each other than they look far apart. I did that as a visual effect. And in the book, I think you probably may agree that I try to show in a way that they're a twin phenomenon. So I actually use the notion of archetypes of twin phenomenon. And the classic sort of archetypes in the Jungian's kind of language, and even some theological languages, there's the archetypes of good and evil, of, the Christ and the devil, and so on and so on. And I think that's a very interesting territory, very dangerous territory, but it's an interesting territory of learning. So the book is a learning experiment. I said, if I can document some of the dynamics of what went on in this particular period of time, understanding Marianne's history coming into it, that maybe people could read this and we could learn some lessons. So I think, as you know, the last chapter is on some lessons. What are some lessons we can take from this? Of course, you can come up with your own lessons, but that's what I did, is I wanted to put some lessons forth. And I tried not to make too many harsh judgments, but as I think you've pointed out, I am critical at times for sure. So I was curious about, do you think there's good lessons to learn between this combination of Trump and Marianne coming together as such archetypal twin phenomenon, but opposites, but sort of complementarities at the same time? You know what I mean? Opposites in the sense they look like enemies on the surface. And then in my own philosophical and in the sort of Taoist philosophical way, opposites are also complementary. In other words, they have something to teach each other. So I'm sort of saying that what Donald Trump is teaching us as a society is also important, just as important as what Marianne is teaching us. I would not say one of them is teaching a more important lesson. So that's an interesting provocation. I actually do believe that's true philosophically. Now, if you ask me who I'd vote for, well, very clearly I'd vote for Marianne.
Yeah, but yeah, what I hear you saying, you're referring like they're filling that vacuum of, and so what he represents is real and needs to be taken seriously and not just dismissed or whatever, right? So yeah, and but I mean, like as we know from Course in Miracles, the whole good evil thing isn't real, right? Because the Course in Miracles says it's not even real, right? So that's why it's kind of, can look at them. You can go, here's Donald Trump, who ended up president. Then you got Marianne Williamson, a new age spiritualist, going, I'm going to run for president, right? Because there's this vacuum. Somebody's got to do something, right?
Right.
And but yet it's I think the bigger thing is that there's something new coming, and we have to learn what it is. We don't know. That's why I see we're in the struggle we're in, is because we don't know what it is, and we have fear as a result, and so it's about facing our fear and welcoming the new reality, whatever it's going to be, and going wherever we're led. And right, led our leadership, right?
So I wish I would have had you write the postscript to it, Richard. What you just sort of articulated now is really what the book didn't sort of go into. Is those are like a symptom, right? Of let's call it the vacuum, the problem. They're kind of symptoms coming up, right? And we get a chance to learn from our symptoms. That's the beauty of symptoms. They're not just bad.
Yeah.
And to divide good and bad would be just really not a holistic approach. So that's what they're doing. But then I think the postscript is what you're just saying. What we probably, both of those leaders need to do is also back off a little, and we need to back off a little and get into a little more humbleness that we probably don't know how to do this next step, if you want to call it that, a next transition, a next transformation. We have ideas about it. So one of my criticisms of, I mean, Trump obviously has his ideas about where the future should be, and Marianne has hers. But even Marianne is open, high consciousness, as I would say she is in so many ways. And she is, you know, one of the teachers of the Course in Miracles. She's caught in what I call a double language talk. Her theology in the Course in Miracles and this kind of esoteric Christian, even, you know, non-dual spiritualist understanding of reality. At the same time, she uses language, and I quote her a few times. I actually do a section of analysis of how she talks about evil. And it's clearly so contradictory to the teachings of the Course in Miracles to me. Well, why? Because she's walking in two worlds. She's walking in her theological world, and then she's having to walk in the world of politics. And she chooses to do that. And I think what you're saying, and I think the postscript of the book, you know, if there is another book follow through, or even the postscript, would be, why don't we just all admit we need to be a little more humble that we don't really know? And that's the problem I find with Marianne, is she's a little bit too much in the know. I mean, she has this great sense of spirit and mystery, and she purveys that to the people she teaches to, that they love it, and they love her teaching. I've watched her enough in doing speeches with, you know, large, huge audiences. She's phenomenal how she's just got them, you know, right there, like a good preacher would, good teacher. And I don't find the humbleness of, and I don't know, you know, just it's sometimes this I feel so strongly about, and then I don't know. And I think that's one of the problems of both having, she has a theological tradition where she constantly quotes the book, you know, the book of Course in Miracles, just like people constantly quote the Bible, who are, you know, or some other religious text or a philosophical text of their favorite philosopher or whatever, or, you know, high power guru that they follow. And that problem always is, you know, you feel like they sound like they always know. And if I probably made, you know, not enough of a good point in my book, I can't actually remember all that's in my book right now, but it would be interesting to read my book and see how much I acknowledge, you know, as for my interest in leadership, how much do I acknowledge and we don't know. And there's so much we are babes in the woods. So when I wrote this book on Four Arrows, because it was my first time following somebody's life work, this was, again, a very intense process of researching his work. And one of the things is the Indigenous perspective, and I'm using his language of what that represents as an Indigenous perspective. And he sees himself as an Indigenous person for various reasons and arguments. That the immense humbleness that us modern people, even the last couple thousands of years, he actually says 9,000 years, pretty much humanity went off track. And he says, but humans have been living on the planet for hundreds of thousands of years. even to 1 million or 2, or maybe in the homeless line and so on. So he's saying our 99% of our history as a species is we were not following these principles that we've now accepted as normal or dominant, the hegemonic, the way it should be. It doesn't matter if you're right or left wing on this. It's like he says, they're all falling under the same dominant worldview, is what he calls.
Yeah.
And so he says, but there's an indigenous world that's 99% of our history as a species. That's the wisdom, because they lived more or less much more in harmony with the world and nature. So I think that is the humbleness I got, Richard, as a biographer, right? And someone studying his work. It really challenged me to, that kind of humbleness, that we've got to look at, traditions beyond left, right, even center, and go beyond that. And so, yeah, I'm a strong believer in bringing that forth. And I'm glad to see Marianne Williamson actually dipped into that a little bit in her work as well. She really respects the worldview of the Indigenous peoples, and she actually consulted with them in a few cases that I saw. But in my view, probably not enough.
Yeah. Well, I didn't know about the Four Arrows book. That can be my next read.
That's a very interesting fellow, let me tell you. Anyways, he writes a lot about fear and fearlessness, and so does Marianne Williamson. And maybe as we wrap up here today, I'll just leave it if you have maybe one last question or a comment you want to make, and just say thank you for today.
Well, yeah, I've enjoyed the conversation very much, Michael, and I appreciate the opportunity. And thank you for writing the books.
You're most welcome.
I'm a reader, so
yeah.
I appreciate it. Yeah.
Well, and
yeah, and it was a very readable book. I mean, it had a lot of footnotes too.
Yeah.
But you did a lot of research, but very readable book. And so yeah, I could read it when I was sick, and I could still, no problem. So
hey, I
appreciate it.
That's a great endorsement. I could read this book when I was sick and had COVID the second time.
Yeah.
It was so well written.
Yeah, political science,
Well, as an author, because I obviously am a scholar as well, and I care a lot about the nuance of knowledge and how we form knowledge, and I like to do a good job of trying to gather as much as I can in the reasonable limits, and still, have a lot of openness to it. But I also was very aware that I want this book to be read. So just for your sake and the audience's, my plan when I gave the proposal to write this book was early enough in 2018, before the election and so on. I actually wanted it to be available in published print 4 to 5 months before the election.
Yeah.
And I had it ready, more or less. The publisher and the publishing process delayed.
Oh.
And it came out 6 months after, or 4 months after the election.
Oh.
I actually wanted it to be part of people's learning and teaching, because everybody was looking at Trump and various leaders who were running. And so I said, wow, that would be a great chance to get that on the market. Then we've got the crazy process of, because it's an academic type publisher, they charge $130 US for a hardcover.
Yeah.
And they're not going to print a soft cover unless it sells enough. So I'm completely stuck, in the publishing realm. If you want to get the exposure of a bigger publisher like these people are, you're stuck as an author today, because they can distribute widely to the world, but then they don't really care much about the local market, and they're selling to libraries, university libraries.
Yeah. Well, it would have been great to have it and, give Marianne Williamson a boost, right? But I think, but the quality of the book, it'll last for posterity.
So I wrote as a journalist in a way. I kind of had a journalistic flair to it, and that forced me to actually write in a different style. So thanks for recognizing that. Okay, good day. Have a good one.
Okay, you too, Michael.